What's up, everybody? My name is Khalil. I'm here with the Ottawa Youth Council. We're working on a very exciting project with the City of Ottawa, and I'm joined here today with Councillor Jeff Leiper.
Khalil, how are you doing?
I'm good. Thank you very much for joining us here
Entirely
today.
my pleasure. Good to see you again.
This is going to be a fun conversation,
Yeah.
not meant to be formal. It's not a formal one-on-one kind of interview, just a conversation to get a little bit of your thoughts on the city, youth's place, and youth's opinions when it comes to the political landscape here in Ottawa. And we just want to know a little bit more about you.
Amazing. Let's go.
So I'd love to start, and I like to know the person before understanding the role that you play, because I believe that, what you do day to day defines very little of who you are at your core, even if it is something that's a huge part of your life. I think there's much more than what you do day to day. So I'd like to ask you, who are you, or who were you as a young person in Ottawa or wherever you grew up?
Yep. And I grew up here in Ottawa.
Awesome.
I went to school in Ottawa. I've lived in the West End. I've lived in the South End, the East End. I've lived in Ottawa all my life. I went to Ottawa U, really born and raised in Ottawa. That's a really good question. And it's a big one, right? Who are you? When I was 18, I had a strong interest in politics. I had a strong interest in communities that work. I had a strong interest in policy, economics, history. I was really into history when I was an 18-year-old. Yeah, it was, and I knew that I wanted to go into university and study history. I wanted to teach history, and I think there's a lot of really cool things happened in past. And talking about history is, on the one hand, a really cool endeavor. Wow, things were different, or wow, things were really the same, or I can't believe that they were able to build the pyramids, or things like that. But there are also really interesting opportunities when you're studying history to try to learn more about what today is. And I think even when I was in high school, I was an academic person. I was interested in arguments, and I was interested in what the right arguments were. Yeah, a very kind of academic, geeky young person who was already developing some strong thoughts about sustainability and things like that. It's interesting. In 1988, I was an 18-year-old. And at that point, we were closer to the 1950s than we are today to 1988. The world has changed a lot. And as I get older and older, I'm really seeing how much the world is changing. Exactly. But when I was 18, we were just starting to develop a really sort of mainstream awareness on the environment. The hole in the ozone was a really big topic of discussion then, and recycling. And I know we're going to talk about like the role of youth. But it's interesting. Blue bins and black bins were a new thing back then, right? So when I was really early in school, we got a newspaper every day, and that newspaper went in the garbage. It went into a landfill, right? And it's interesting because they introduced recycling for paper. And I think you'll hear from a lot of people that the success of recycling paper, because that was a big change, was actually the kids in the household who were in school, and they were developing this sort of environmental sense, a sustainability sense, and they were the ones who shamed their parents. Why are you throwing the newspaper into the garbage? Right, that goes into recycling. It was the dawn of a more mass awareness out of the more niche 60s awareness about some of the environmental issues. So yeah, I was developing a really early interest in the environment, in politics, and frankly in studying all of that as well.
So did you end up studying history?
I did. I studied history. My focus, I went to Ottawa U, and so our focus was very much on Canadian history. And at Ottawa U, you study a lot of Canadian history in the context of Quebec and the rest of Canada. I think if you go to Carleton, you've got a more global perspective of history, but Ottawa U was a little more focused. And I ultimately wound up being really interested in the history of Ottawa. It doesn't seem all that exciting, but there were some really fascinating moments in Ottawa's history. And I actually had an opportunity at our heritage meeting. I think it was last week, or it might have been last week. And I can't remember. We are proposing to make the Byward Market a national historic site. So we're going to apply as a city. Yeah, it'll be fun. we're going to apply as a city to the federal government to say, please designate this a national historical site. And I had the opportunity at that meeting to talk about something which I became fascinated with in university, which was the Stony Monday riot. I won't get into the whole thing, but there came a moment in Ottawa's history in 1849 when English farmers with cannons were facing French and Irish workers who were also armed with cannons across what was then called the Sappers Bridge, which was the bridge that crossed the Rideau Canal, just in between what was then Barracks Hill, but now is Parliament Hill, and the Chateau Laurier. And I have this vision in my head of these English farmers and these Irish and French workers facing off with each other with some British troops standing in between them to keep the peace. And you know what? That was one of the last violent episodes in Ottawa's history. And when I walk down City Hall today and I take a look at the paintings of the mayors, I see Irish names, French names, English names. The roots of Ottawa's multiculturalism, some would argue, including me, have their root in that day when those groups didn't fight one another and found ways to accommodate each other in Ottawa moving forward. So, that study of history was fascinating to me and has certainly stayed with me these many years.
With how long you've been in the city of Ottawa, you mentioned how you grew up here and all of your work that you've done here in the city. I want to ask you a question which gives you a chance to offer a little bit of perspective. What would an 18-year-old Jeff think if he was here with us? What would he think about everything that you've done here in the city?
That's a good question. So 18-year-old Jeff was a transit rider. At 18, I was living in Orleans and I was going back and forth to downtown using the bus. The bus worked back then. I think 18-year-old Jeff would be, on the one hand, very disappointed at the state of our transit today and disbelieving that it's working as poorly as it is, but also would be just fascinated by the train. And my father was a transportation nerd. He worked at StatsCan in basically counting boats and cars and trains and all that sort of stuff, to put it very simply. And he shared with me his enthusiasm for some of the transit projects. So the transitway was pretty new back then. Today, that transitway, much of it, or I think all of it, has been converted into light rail. But when that transitway running through Saint Laurent Station first opened, and those platforms were there with those big pipes for the ventilation and everything, my father shared that with me. And I think I took away some of his transportation nerd leanings, because if I was 18 and I saw the LRT running, especially coming right by my house when I was 18, I think I would have been absolutely fascinated by that. I would have been disappointed as well as an 18-year-old that we are becoming a less equal society and not a more equal society. The growing inequality in our city and in our world was probably, you could start to see it happen in the 1980s when I was growing up with the neoliberal policies that were being implemented by leaders like Thatcher and Reagan. Much of our society today has got its roots in that. The general consensus of the 1950s and the 1960s that, yeah, we're a capitalist society, but we have to make sure that everyone is coming along with us, kind of fell apart in the 1980s. And today in 2025, we're seeing the growing inequality that I think 18-year-old Jeff might not have believed possible, because I didn't really understand at the time, being as young as I was, what was going on with what Reagan was doing. That's not to say that there were young people around me who did understand that stuff, right? I think about some of the protest music of the time and some of the protest movements that young people had, like the punk movement, right? There were thinkers in the punk movement who understand.
Rebels.
Yeah, and they understood where these policies were going. They were able to discern in what was happening, what that long-term future would look like. I didn't. The 1980s were also a very kind of vacuous time, and with Madonna and Michael Jackson on the charts, it was pretty awesome. But the society that we have today has its roots back then, and I guess I personally wouldn't have believed at that young age that we would get to this point today where so many of the inequalities in society are as exacerbated as they are.
Absolutely. Good point. I want to talk a little bit about youth's place when it comes to politics, because I feel like that can be distant at times, or maybe there's a misconception that there's a lack of care or a lack of understanding. I also think it's, politics is framed, at least in the modern way, it's framed in a way that makes information really difficult to understand.
Okay.
And sometimes certain things, the way that they're put out there, kind of just makes it difficult to really get an understanding of. And I think that misinformation or the way that information is framed it doesn't necessarily invite us to the table.
Interesting.
That's just my personal opinion, very subjective, of course, but I think that's something that I've heard from colleagues and friends of mine and people that I know in my network. So my question to you is, why do you think city politics can feel so far removed from everyday people, especially younger folks?
Yeah. And I tend to agree with you. What we do at City Hall is pretty opaque, and
Yeah.
it's difficult to really find a way in sometimes. Part of it is because we do, as politicians and as a bureaucracy, a really poor job of explaining in clear terms how the city works. You and I had a discussion the other day about the budget, and I gave you the budget. And I can't remember how much that weighs, but it's several pounds. It's huge.
Yeah.
And it's lines and lines that use terms that are simply not explained in the budget anywhere. It's complex and it's massive, and it feels really overwhelming to try to get to be a part of. When I got elected in 2014, I had been with my community association for about 17 years. And in the course of those 17 years, I developed a facility with city policy, because my colleagues and I in the community association were trying to affect change. And over the course of a long time, I learned how the city works and how to be effective at advocating for change. But without the benefit of a long period of study and a long period of working with the material, when you first encounter the city, when you first encounter its processes, when you first encounter its policies, when you first encounter its rules, it is massively difficult to understand. There's very few people who are able to help explain it.
Now, you know what? I normally tend to give the benefit of the doubt because I think, well, it's just procedural. This is their process, right? And they can't really, there's very few times where you can get away from the process, right? Because things have to be done in a procedural way.
We're constrained by what the law says, right? So the city of Ottawa is basically a not-for-profit corporation that has been created by the province to handle certain decision-making. And there are pieces of legislation that the province passes that tell the city what it can and can't do. And even just understanding that can be a real hurdle to engaging with the city. And I don't think that politicians and bureaucrats have invested the necessary resources to help people to open those doors to City Hall, to make it less mysterious. I think we'll talk in a bit, but I would encourage people just to call their city councilor and say, hey, how does this all work?
Or even know who your city council is in your jurisdiction, right?
Find out who they are. Absolutely. And I'll say you can call 311 and you can say, here's where I live. Who is my city councilor? And that's a great first step. But we don't do a very good job of inviting people in. And I'm not sure that is because we don't want people in, right? There's no city councilor sitting around that table who believes that we have done nearly enough to get youth involved in city politics. So tomorrow we're going to pass a big new bylaw that changes the zoning for every property in the city. We're going to allow more tall towers near transit. We're going to allow people to build bigger houses with more units on all the different properties in the city. And my intention, and I know my colleagues' intention from the start, was to say, this is going to be really controversial because there are people who want their neighborhoods to not change, right? But we have talked to our planners. We recognize the need for the city to change, and the beneficiaries of a new zoning bylaw, by and large, are going to be youth. But when you talk to youth on the street and you say, hey, we're doing a new zoning bylaw tomorrow, eyes glaze over, right? It seems extraordinarily dry. And it's a lot of work to try to get people to understand what the relationship is between zoning and how affordable their life is, how we're addressing greenhouse gases, how transit is going to work, how high our taxes are going to be. It's related to all of that. And the best intentions of city councilors are to say, you know what? We'll go to Ottawa U and we'll go to Carleton U and we'll get the student federations involved in this discussion so that they can advocate for changes that maybe some older residents who don't want their neighborhoods to change, we can have a more balanced conversation. But it takes time to engage. It takes resources to engage. It takes expertise to engage. Some councillors are really good at it. That's their background. They come at it from that background. Other councillors are coming at it from very different perspectives. The people who the residents of Ottawa elect are a pretty motley crew of community association presidents. I mean, we've got Wilson Lowe as a bus operator. I'm trying to think if we have any lawyers. There's often lawyers involved in politics. I don't think in this term we do have any lawyers. But, Riley Brockington sits next to me. He was a StatsCan economist. It's a pretty motley crew. The skill sets are not necessarily there to say, how can I effectively bring in the youth of Ottawa into a zoning conversation, get them engaged and get their voices at the same table as the people who may be working to have less change. It's money, resources, and time. And that's something I'd love to see the city do a lot more work on. And I'm really thankful that organizations like Youth Ottawa are starting to knock on our doors and not waiting for us to start that conversation. They're like, we want to have that conversation.
And this is what we've got. Yeah. We've got the platform to do it. Let's, start working. Something like this as well as something that I think we'll start to see a little bit more of.
Hope so. And you know what? I think you're going to find that city councillors welcome it because not every city councillor, including myself, knows best how to engage communities. But when the experts in community engagement are coming to us and saying,
experience is how you can learn, right? Yeah. Through just experiencing it rather than just being opposed to it because it's something that hasn't been done before.
This is great.
It's key. Yeah. So we talk about that kind of youth involvement. And I want to ask you, what are ways, because I think sometimes we tend to think, I just have to vote. I just need to vote more. And that's how they want me to get involved because ultimately they want something out of me. And that's my vote, right? Because it'll help them, gain a higher presence in the city. But I want to ask you beyond voting, because there are other ways that we can get involved. What are some other ways that youth can get involved to make a change?
Great question. And I'm glad you asked. And voting is that fundamental precondition. I think the voters of Ottawa tend to skew older. They tend to skew more affluent. They tend to skew more towards property owners. And there's nothing wrong with any of that. But I think the youth vote is missing because we know that the youth voice can be missing because they don't vote in the same numbers as other groups. And politicians, we pay attention to votes. And so you've very well stated the importance of voting. And I just want to reiterate that. But civil society is a great way. There is strength in numbers. It's cliche, but there is absolutely strength in numbers. Joining organizations that are working on the issues that you care about and collaborating with peers is the next most important thing that people can do. I think there's a tendency with social media to make assumptions about how effective a tweet can be. And you're not going to change policy by posting at politicians. Right? There is a level of sophistication that advocacy needs that cannot be accomplished without people collaborating with each other and sharing the workload because it is a lot of work. I think about Ottawa and I think about the ways in which residents would like to see Ottawa be better. And for almost anything you can think about, there is a group of residents who are working together and collaborating to try to achieve their vision for the city. Whether we're talking about more sustainable ways of transportation, biking, pedestrians, whether you think about affordable housing, whether you're thinking about more diverse recreation opportunities, there is probably someone out there or a group of people who are working to try to achieve that. Finding those people and offering your help and shouldering some of the work is one of the most effective ways in which to accomplish change. Bear with me because it takes a bit of time. One of the most effective lobby campaigns I ever saw was happening around the time of my first election in 2014. And there were a couple of residents who thought it was really important that
Sorry to cut you off.
Yeah.
What is a lobby campaign?
So there was a group of people who wanted to influence city council to enact policies that they wanted. And so you think about the spectrum of everything that the city does.
Yeah.
There are groups of people who want the city to put in place different policies, better policies. One of the groups of people who a lot of us got introduced to in 2014 was, I think it started with a couple of residents who wanted the city of Ottawa to ban the sale of cats, dogs, and rabbits in pet stores, unless those were rescue adoptions. So they were really concerned because a lot of the puppies that were being sold in pet stores are coming from puppy mills. And so if they could cut off pet stores as a way to sell those puppies, they could start to really eliminate puppy mills. So they started the Facebook group, and they've started to engage with residents. They invited residents to say, hey, engage with us, like our page, follow what we're doing. And that Facebook page grew to be several thousand people. And then that the leaders of that movement, if you will, started going to election debates to say, if you were elected, would you ban the sale of dogs, cats, and rabbits in pet stores? And of course, all of us who were running for the first time, we're keen to win as many votes as we can. And I'm like, yes, you know what? I would absolutely, if I get elected, I will do that. And the reason I wanted to make that commitment to them was because they had the engagement of thousands of people, right? There's a real opportunity for me as a politician who wants to get elected to win a lot of votes. And then I did win. A number of other politicians won their elections who made that same promise. And then the group came back to us and they're like, so in the debates, you promised.
This is what you promised.
And
you follow
will
up?
you follow through? And we wound up following through, and we banned the sale of cats, dogs, and rabbits in pet stores, except for rescue animals. Great lobby effort, but it took a lot of people collaborating and focused to make it happen. It isn't just waking up and saying, here's the change I want to see, and firing an email.
Share it, yeah.
Yeah, or share it on a social media. That is nowhere near as effective as the power of numbers. And if you're wondering who is working on the things that I care about, you can ask in social media. You'll see their names in the articles. Being informed about what's going on in the city is really critical. Staying abreast of stories coming out of City Hall is important. And you can ask a councillor. People ask me all the time, look, I'd really like to see Ottawa develop more sustainable environmental policies. I'd like to work with other people to try to accomplish it because I know that numbers matter. Who's working in this space? And I can point them to say, well, you know what? Ecology Ottawa needs your help. And Ecology Ottawa is forcing us to do better as a city. And I think that you would benefit from collaborating with those groups of people. There are some things that are really, really difficult, though, right now that are concerning in that the media has become so shrunken in the city. Even compared to when I first got elected. When I got elected in 2014, The Citizen and The Sun and the CBC and CTV all had reporters working in City Hall, and they had multiple reporters working in City Hall. Yeah. And those reporters developed a real understanding of how City Hall worked. And so when they wrote articles, it was very informed. The economic crisis in local reporting means that there are far fewer reporters now, which means that residents are getting less insight into what's going on at City Hall. And that's a real challenge that, a lot of us are trying to figure out, how are we going to try to address that? City councillors all put out an email newsletter that talks about, here's what I'm doing, here's what I think is important, here's some of what's going on in the community. Signing up for that is one of the really easy ways to start getting aware of what's going on in the community. You have to read it with a critical eye. Right. Yeah. I often tell people, my newsletter in my ward has become, it's a staple. People depend on that newsletter to find out what's going on at City Hall that the media is not reporting on, because the media doesn't have the resources to report on everything anymore. And I tell people, be careful, right? Your only source of news can't be me. I'm a politician, and you probably shouldn't trust me. But at least there are things in there about, here are the debates that are happening at City Hall, and you'll get some insight into what your city councillor is thinking about. Subscribing to your city councillor's newsletter is one great first way to find out, what does the city do? What are the mechanisms by which it does it? And where might I get interested in helping out?
Absolutely. And just to close that point too, I think it's really important to target your concerns, right, to specific city councillors that are working in the space or in the area of your concern, right? So I think that's just a small way right there to not only air out your concern, but
Yeah.
air it out to the right area so that you can understand more of how this can be changed.
Yeah.
I think that's really key. I want to talk about council city debates.
Okay.
So when council city debates things like housing, transit, or public space, are young folks considered in those conversations? How are they considered? Are they taken into account? Where they show up in those conversations?
So in some of the debates that we have, I think younger Ottawa residents have some good voice through some of the groups who are participating in a expert and active way. So for example, in our transit debates, a couple of groups, Free Transit Ottawa, Better Transit Ottawa, they are young groups.
Yeah.
The folks, and they are persistent in voicing their concerns to city council, and we know what their concerns are. I think every city council around the table generally agrees with them. We have the hard part of prioritizing things, but we generally agree our transit needs to work for younger riders. I'm really encouraged that the Ottawa U and Carleton U populations are seeing increasing representation because the student federations there it's unfortunate, in not this year's debate, but the previous year's debate, we proposed raising the student price for the passes that they pay. They have U passes, which are paid for through their student fees, and we were proposing to increase that by more than we normally would. And both of the student federations were like, hold up, right? I won't get into the whole debate, but ever since then, they have become much more active with city council, paying attention to what city council is saying, because the issues that city council are dealing with are ones that strike directly at the quality of life for youth. And it's unfortunate that it came about because we tried to do something to students. But I'm glad we did, because now those student organizations are really heavily engaged with us. There are some issues where students or young people are not necessarily part of the discussion. Recreation is one where I wonder how we can better get youth representation at the table when we're discussing what to do. One of the really interesting areas. Look, if we're talking about soccer and having enough soccer fields, there are a lot of today millennial parents who have kids who need to go into soccer, kids who need to go into hockey. Those millennial parents are voters. They have the time to participate in our debates. They know, they have a better idea than somebody who's much younger how to effectively engage with their city councillor, and they're not intimidated to do so. But we don't think about teenagers very much. So if we're thinking about, do we have enough soccer programs? There's lots of parents out there who are advocating for those soccer programs. Do we have enough swimming lessons? There's lots of parents out there arguing for the best possible swimming programs for their kids. We've got a big gaping hole when it comes to teenagers and young adults. If you go through the list of recreation programming, you're going to see a lot of great programming for seniors. You're going to see a lot of great programming for young children, but you're not going to see a whole ton for teenagers. I think our libraries are doing a better job than the city is, but there are some exceptions. And again, it's because of folks who are collaborating with each other and strength in numbers and persistence, and that's the skateboard community. The skateboard community, I would suggest, over the years has gotten fed up with the lack of attention paid to it by city government. And they have been persistent over the course of 10 years in saying, we need skateboard facilities in the city. And they're succeeding. Right? They got their voice at the table just through sheer will and persistence. And now we're building some great skateboard parks. If you haven't had the chance to use the one at Bob Macquarie, I haven't actually used it. I don't skateboard. I don't skate myself.
Or rollerblades?
I don't rollerblade either. No,
Okay.
I bike around. The bowl that they built at Macquarie terrifies me. I looked at it. We opened up a new skateboard park in Bob Macquarie in Orleans, and I look over the edge. Like I walked up the slope and I looked over the edge, and there's this incredibly
Just straight down.
deep. Well, I had no idea how the lawyers gave the city permission to build that. Someone is going to get hurt in there, obviously, but that's part of skating, right?
It is a high risk sport.
It is, but we did it, and we did it because the skateboard community. But I think about all the things that we're not doing for youth. It's difficult if your interest is in, I don't know, music or food or any of these other sort of areas where we don't really think very much about teenagers and young adults when we create our programming. And it's because there's no groups who are persistent at advocating with us.
You're right. And I think it's difficult to get those groups started because they're so young and they don't know how to advocate for that change. Like if I'm a 16-year-old and I'm into soccer and that's all I love, but I live all the way in Orleans, I have to go all the way to, for example, the RA Center to find like a really nice soccer field to play at, that can be a challenge for me to commute to, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's difficult, but I think you also bring up a good point of, hey, parents are the ones who also advocate for their children when they realize, hey, my kid's really into swimming and we should have more swimming programs open for my child, right? So I think that's a good point, but there should still be at least concern or a conversation opened up to understand how to get their voices on board and how to listen to them effectively. Maybe it doesn't have to be a lobby campaign. Maybe it doesn't have to be, the ways that, strengthen numbers, like the way you mentioned. But I think it's important to at least consider that and understand how we can kind of start to think about that and think about their voice.
I'm thinking about that young person who might be 21 years old, who's really interested in food. And would love if the city could find ways to use the resources that the city has to create more recreation opportunities for young people to gather and learn and collaborate around food. Right now, that effort doesn't exist. And I'm speaking obviously entirely in hypotheticals, but to that young person who's thinking about how could the city better serve young people who are interested in recreation, food as recreation, talk to your city councillor.
Bring up the concern, right?
Yep. And we can help guide you and tell you what the path is to actually achieving that and provide you with the advice that you can do it.
You're just not aware of it, right?
Yeah. There's a lot of programming for youth that just doesn't exist because our focus is on the things that people are advocating for on a persistent basis, which is children and seniors. There's a lot for children and seniors because parents and seniors are really effective advocates for themselves. Where for youth, I think about skateboarding where they've done a great job advocating with this, but I think about others and we hear it, and every now and then someone's like, what about teenagers? And we're like, man, we don't have enough for teenagers. But then we have another stakeholder group that is being very persistent and effective at arguing for our attention. And we pivot to that. So there is strength in numbers, and how you put those numbers together, how you advocate is something that every city councillor around the table would be happy to talk to people.
I think there's a common misconception when it comes to what people think is a city decision, or, sometimes maybe new zoning restrictions are put in place or something happens in your city that you might think, oh, that's a provincial decision or that's a federal decision, maybe even. So what would you say is something people wouldn't realize is a city decision?
Yeah. And there is a lot of confusion out there. And I fully understand why. Like we probably do an inadequate job in our schools of teaching what the different levels of government do. One of the things that comes across my desk a lot are rent issues. There is, I think, a perception that the city could require landlords to charge less rent I'll leave it at that, to charge less rent, or that the city councillor is able to help in disputes around rent. We get a lot of those sort of requests, and it's very frustrating as a city councillor to say, look, you're going through something that is obviously extremely stressful and is affecting your quality. Exactly. And it's not city. And I think there is absolutely a role for our education system to focus more on what the different levels of government do. It's not immediately obvious to people why rent is not something that the city controls. There are other issues across my desk where there are confusion. how construction occurs on a construction site is not necessarily regulated by the city. There's an effort to try to control, say, the types of vehicles that are allowed on the road. The city doesn't have any control over that. I think what I ask people to keep in mind, and I start a number of my conversations, there are actually only two levels of government in Canada. The Canadian Constitution sets out that there is a federal government and there is a provincial government. And there are things that the federal government is responsible for in the Constitution. There are things that the provincial government is responsible for. And if it's something new and it's not assigned to either of them, it goes to the feds.
Okay.
The province is responsible for municipal affairs, and it has created acts like the Planning Act and the Municipal Act to describe what cities can and can't do, what their areas of responsibility are. And cities can't go beyond what those responsibilities are that are set out. So it can be frustrating to people, but cities have exactly the powers that provinces give them, and no more.
That makes sense. Okay. Clears it up a little bit. I want to ask you about Lansdowne 2.0. You know, it's a project that I think is expected to be complete by 2030, and sounds like some exciting new stuff that's coming about. I know you've had some public opinion about Lansdowne 2.0. Could you tell me about some of those?
Yeah, I voted against moving ahead with Lansdowne 2.0. We're going to spend roughly $400 million to do it. For those who may not be familiar, Lansdowne Park is obviously the football stadium at Lansdowne Park, and then there's the Civic Center, which is the arena that's underneath the stands. And no doubt they need to be replaced at some point. They are falling apart. They weren't rebuilt when the south side stands were, and Lansdowne Park was redeveloped. So we're going to spend about $400 million to build a new north side stands and a new event center. There are a lot of reasons to believe that, for example, the event center is the wrong size. I'm sure that some of the people watching this will have seen the debate that's happened around the PWHL, the Professional Women's Hockey League, and the Ottawa Charge, who are very concerned that the new event center we're going to build is too small for them to viably play in. And beyond sort of some very specific concerns, it's going to take up more of the green space that's at Lansdowne Park because it's not going to be underneath anymore. They're building a new event center in the lawn. More concerning maybe than some of the specifics, though, is we haven't had an honest conversation with residents, in my view, about how this is all going to be paid for. So we're going to borrow, call it $400 million that will have to be repaid. And we own these facilities, absolutely. But we need to borrow, roughly $400 million. And the assertion on the part of proponents of Lansdowne 2.0 is that we're going to recoup a lot of the costs of paying back that debt through our partnership with the Ottawa Sports and Entertainment Group. In Lansdowne 1.0, we developed a partnership with the Ottawa Sports and Entertainment Group. They run the Red Blacks, they run the Ottawa 67s, they serve as the property managers, if you will, for Lansdowne 1.0. And as they rent facilities out and operate their teams, they were supposed to generate profits. A portion of those profits were going to come back to the city. There's never been any profit. The financial assumptions that they made went completely unrealized. And yet we've decided to borrow $400 million to build a new arena that's probably too small, on the hopes that the rebuild is going to allow the Ottawa Sports and Entertainment Group, our partnership with them, the opportunity to recoup enough money that it will cost next to nothing to rebuild the stands. And that's just not true. I don't believe that those financial projections are going to be borne out. I think the taxpayer is going to have a much larger burden than what the city has been saying they will. And at a time when we've got a lot of problems and crises and issues in the city, I'm not sure that people would have voted to go ahead and rebuild the Lansdowne Stadium and Event Center now, when the taxes that will go into that could be put into other things. We know in the city we've got a couple of different declared crises, right? We know we've got an opioid crisis. We know we've got a housing crisis. We know that we've got a climate crisis. And money that's going into Lansdowne is not money that's going in to address those. We haven't declared it a crisis, but I don't think anyone around that council table believes that our bus system is working very well, right? It's clearly struggling. We have other priorities than Lansdowne Park today.
And how does the city weigh those concerns?
Yeah, that's
because there's opposing views, right?
Of
There's
course.
people who are for the Lansdowne 2.0 budget,
Yep.
which is why it's going ahead,
Yep.
and people who are against.
Yeah.
How does that work?
So there is an argument to be made. I want to be, fairly objective here. I am one of the people who, like many of my colleagues who voted in favor of Lansdowne 2.0, believe that we should have a municipally owned football stadium and that we should have a municipally owned arena and event center. Cities do, right? You can't, no CFL team owns its own stadium, and they just can't afford to build one in the CFL. These are not NFL teams. There's, and junior hockey doesn't play in their own arena. They can't afford to build their own arena. The Senators can afford to build their own arena, right? NHL teams build and own an arena. The junior sports that we love so much, now the women's hockey that we love so much, the ability to attract, I don't know, the Scott Tournament of Hearts or the Briar, junior hockey. The ability to attract the boat show or the cottage show. Like a municipal arena is part of the fabric of every major community across Canada, and I believe we should own one. It shouldn't, if we're going to attract economic development things or activity like semi-pro sports or like conventions or all these things, we need to have those facilities that are run in the public interest and not to the profit of an NHL team. So my colleagues want to get it built. They want to redo the stands. They are fed up with the accessibility issues at Lansdowne Park. And, through the course of the discussion about Lansdowne and rebuilding the Civic Center, I finally started taking notice of some of the accessibility problems. I have season tickets to the Ottawa Charge, and my seats are like second row. I love my seats. Walking down, there's no handrail to get from the concourse level down to my seats. That wouldn't fly today, right? You can't have these steps that go down for, 50, 60 feet and not have a handrail. If you use a mobility device, there are like a few spots where you can enjoy a PWHL or an Ottawa 67s game or a Blackjacks game. You don't have the opportunity to enjoy these games from the premium seats, and you don't necessarily even have the opportunity to enjoy them from the really cheapest seats. The choice is just not there. It's like, well, here's where we can accommodate wheelchairs because it was designed in a time when accessibility was a very different kind of consideration. So I know some of my colleagues are like, okay, it may cost us a lot today, but we need to rebuild it. We don't believe that we can wait very much longer. And we believe the projections that have been put on our desk, where we believe that we can offset the cost of building this with the revenues that are going to come in through all these different sources. And they chose to vote in favor of Lansdowne 2.0, and ultimately it was a majority of council that determined to do so. There's none of the issues with which city council deals are ever easy, and it is often difficult to determine finally who's right? There's a lot of, there's risks, and there's uncertainty, and there's imperfect information, nuance. It's nothing the city council does is ever easy. Actually, I shouldn't say that. I'm sure every now and then we have slam dunk decisions. If you ever attend a city council meeting, you'll notice that we actually only debate 2, maybe 3 of the items that are on our agenda. Everything else just carries after having gone through the committee process, right? Some things are relatively easy. Clearly, yes, we need to approve the zoning for this property at a slightly higher height. That's easy. Yep, that's what we should do. But there are, every city council meeting, 2 or 3 issues where councilors disagree. Stuff, the headline stuff where we're going to decide it with a vote. And we're going to have all the work of listening to stakeholders, listening to residents, and trying to make up our minds.
As recently as last week, the 2026 budget has been approved for the city of Ottawa for the next year. You voted against it. Can you tell me why?
Yeah. So I find that the city is just not working the way it should, and right across the spectrum of what the city does. We're investing very heavily in policing. We're not putting a commensurate investment into alternative response to mental health that over the long term will be much more effective at keeping cities safe. We're not investing in our transit system the way we need to get people from A to B. We're not maintaining our assets. Our roads are falling apart. There are, right across the spectrum, we are underinvesting in building the kind of city that residents want to live in. We've got some, it's not easy. It's relatively easy to say that, right? How you actually address that is going to be a more difficult conversation. we could do everything we wanted to do if we were willing to raise our taxes by some very large amount. But the residents of Ottawa don't want us to raise taxes by large amounts. So that gets us into conversations about, okay, do our taxes go up for certain things? Do we start cutting things at the city that we think are less important than the things we want to do? But we're not having those conversations. The budget that was put in front of us was a status quo budget in which everything got a little bit more money, and we're just going to continue to do things the way we've been doing them. And I don't think that's acceptable. And I don't think the residents of Ottawa ready to accept that the city will just be the way it is in perpetuity. I think residents have got an appetite to see things work better. They want to see their transit work better. They want to see their roads repaired. They want to see alternative response to mental health as a way of addressing mental health crisis. There's a lot of things that people want us to do that this budget simply doesn't do.
There was also a lot of reaction online to your budget remarks, your closing speech to the mayor, and people are talking about what it means for property taxes, services, and the cost of living. How should youth interpret how these budget decisions can affect their day-to-day lives?
That's a big question, and I thank you very much for asking it. Some of the things are really easy to understand. Transit is something that a lot of youth use, and the underinvestment in transit, cutting route frequencies, route comprehensiveness, like how many routes we have in the neighborhoods that they serve, that affects, I think, predominantly youth in a really disproportionate way. And I just need to go to Tunney's pasture today and talk to somebody younger looking to find out what they think of the state of our transit system. But there are some other things as well. Like, we started this conversation talking about how youth could become more engaged in the decisions the City Hall has. And one of my replies to you was the city could do a better job of explaining how the city works and inviting the youth voice to the table. Well, that takes money. Right? If we are underinvesting in our communications channels, if we're underinvesting in our outreach channels, that freezes youth out of the conversation. There are parks and recreation. Skate, and I don't want to stereotype youth, right? Like not every youth is into skateboarding and basketball and all those sort of things, but we are underinvesting in a lot of the recreation activities that might focus more on youth and young adults compared to soccer or things that younger children might want. We can't stop making sure we have lots of soccer fields, and we can't stop making sure we got lots of play structures for younger children. But we also need to invest in the recreation opportunities for youth that they're asking us for, or that they would benefit from. But we're not. And so when our budget doesn't invest in recreation facilities for youth, so what do youth do? Right? Maybe they're going to coffee shops, they're spending money on things that could be provided in a more affordable way, leveraging the resources that the city has. There are probably a lot of youth who are able to enjoy private recreation opportunities, right? I think, for example, the ability to go to Tremblant and ski, right? That's a great opportunity that people of all ages are going to enjoy, right? But that's one way that if I am a relatively comfortably off or even affluent parent, that I can help keep my teenager engaged and active, right? Let's go to Tremblant, grab your buddies, we're going to go skiing for the day. That's not an opportunity that is available to everyone in this city, right? There is a really strong role to play. We can't assume that the private sector and that private facilities are going to meet the needs of all youth. We have to be very thoughtful about how we meet the needs of youth who don't have affluent parents who can take advantage of those private opportunities. This budget doesn't do it, but if you are a youth thinking about what could the budget do, equity in recreation opportunities might not come immediately to mind, but it's one of many areas in which the budget has the opportunity or doesn't to address quality of life for young Ottawa residents.
Absolutely. And I can really appreciate the important distinction that you made there, that not all youth are the same, right? There's a huge difference between, for example, marginalized youth versus other folks as well. So it's important to understand that distinction. It's important to understand that there's different races that we need to cater to. There's different income levels that we need to cater to. And I think the lack of opportunity for recreational activities, for example, we know that's a missing gap in the city. It makes it difficult to then break it down further and make sure that we cater to, okay, what about this specific income level? Can we offer activities for that? So I think it's very important that we start to at least open up that conversation to get youth involved in that way, so that we can start to, focus on the segments that are missing in the city.
If I see a group of racialized youth in a park hanging out, I'm worried, A, that there are going to be neighbors for whom that is unwelcome, who are making assumptions based on race. But I also see a huge opportunity, right? Why isn't this? Those folks are looking for something to do, right? How do we as a city take advantage of the fact that, these youth are in our park and help provide them with, meaningful recreation?
Matters to them.
You're invited here.
Absolutely.
This is your space.
That's so important.
Right.
It's so key. I want to talk about youth's voices. I know you talked about it a little bit before, but I still think there's this, this gap and this distinction that it can feel very distant. And again, that lack of care or lack of engagement in youth when it comes to politics. I want to ask you, where do you think young people actually have influence right now, even if they don't realize it? Because I think that's key, right?
Yeah.
To know that, you think there's this gap missing where your voice it's not only invited, it's needed for us to make effective decisions. And it gives youth a platform to access, to be like, okay, this is where I'm actually needed and where I'm being invited to the table. Let me bring my opinion forth, right?
Huge one is zoning, right? Like, we're going to pass this new zoning bylaw tomorrow, and then council will pass it sometime in January. And it has, despite everyone around the table's best intentions, it has been crafted with almost no direct input from youth. And youth would have had the opportunity to push us more aggressively in certain directions around intensification, housing choice, and getting conversations going between established neighbors and the youth who want to move into those neighborhoods. Oftentimes, city councillors, and again, I will be very generous with my colleagues and say city councillors are thinking about youth. But the person who is pushing back at someone who is concerned about opening their neighborhood to more people for various different and sometimes legitimate reasons is the city councillor. And I think that makes it difficult for that resident who may be concerned about the change that's coming to their neighborhood to be empathetic. It's difficult to be empathetic to a politician, to say, okay, like, you're talking to me about ensuring that my neighborhood is open to younger people, that there is housing choice, that there's affordable housing for younger people who want to move in here. But all you really want is the tax money because you're a politician. And, people don't like us. And I get it. But it's really difficult to tell a young person that face to face. Oh, you want to move into my neighborhood because you want to have a great quality of life. That's not a discussion. It's like, okay, like, I get it, right? You want to have the same opportunities that I did in order to have it. And you get a more empathetic and generous conversation going. Having youth at the table more directly than just relying on city councillors to channel their children, it would have been a really important opportunity. And the failure is on me, and the failure is on a lot of different people for not ensuring that happens. I often start a lot of my speeches with, I think about my 23-year-old, right? And I channel my 23-year-old. And people get it, like other people who have 23-year-olds think about their kids as well. But it's very different for me to tell you, here's how I think my 23-year-old would view this issue, versus my 23-year-old at the table to tell you, here's how I view this issue and here's how it affects me. I think on virtually the entire, zoning is one thing where I think the voice of youth would have been really, really important to have in there. And it's not youth's fault that they weren't engaged. It's on us. But there are probably very few issues on which youth couldn't have or would have a more influential voice if we were able to help them to effectively use it.
So we've spoken about city council. We've spoken about youth's place in politics. We've spoken about municipal government, and I want to mention something that's a pressing issue for a lot of youths and honestly a lot of people in the city right now, which is the economic stability in the city right now. Speaking from experience, I'm 22 years old. I'm just approaching graduation. I'm struggling with the job market. I feel overwhelmed, with everything that I that's coming, and things that haven't even come yet for me. And it's very difficult to deal with everything, the rising cost of living, groceries, rent. A lot of things are just very difficult to deal with in the moment. Politics and even getting involved with my municipal government feels distant and sometimes irrelevant, to be honest with you, because it's like, how is this going to solve the problem that's right in front of me, of finding a job, of dealing with the rising cost of living, of public transit being so expensive. So but I can understand now that I'm more involved in the conversations, that no, these things do affect certain things, and now that I can understand how they do affect them, I can be more involved. Like this budget that's just passed, if my bus fare goes up, I know why, because I've decided to increase the bus fares. So my question to you is, what would you say to young people who don't see how municipal policy translates into their everyday life?
It does.
Certainly does.
It does. So the cost of housing is something that the municipal government has a lot to do with. Not everything, but a lot to do with. Transit, you've mentioned. We've talked about recreation opportunities. How safe the street is. We're a couple of guys talking here. We haven't even brought gender into the conversation. How many women are taking Ubers to move around the city because they don't necessarily feel safe walking around their city. There's, cost of living and affordability goes across a whole range of things for which the city is responsible. And I think what I would encourage, and I think I've said it a couple of times now, is call your councillor for a coffee or pop by their office. I started doing pop-up office hours when I first got elected, and more councillors do those now. So if you subscribe to your councillor's newsletter or follow their social media, you'll see that, next Tuesday, your councillor is going to be at the Starbucks. It's at Holland Cross from 5 until 6 or from 5 until 8 or something. Pop by and talk, have a chat. I do those every 2 weeks somewhere in the ward. Pop by and talk to your councillor. I think there's we suffer from a perception as city councillors that we are being driven around, that we are kind of above the fray. City councillors get elected, as I said, from a whole wide range of backgrounds. We sit in our office and we answer email all day. Almost every city councillor is reading the emails that come in. Your MP, your MPP, the mayor is not reading those resident emails. City council is kind of a grunt job. Right? We read our own email. We walk around our streets. We go to resident meetings. Saturday morning, I was at a resident's house. The plow operator keeps hitting the base of his steps, right? And I'm like, okay, I will come out and I will absolutely take a look at that, right? And here's a resident who had every legitimate reason to expect that if he asked me to come out and see what's going on with his step, that I'll do that, right? You know what? That's what you pay me for as a taxpayer. Is you want that? I would absolutely do that. There is no reason why youth can't call up their city councillor and say, here's what I'm concerned about, but be open-minded. Understand that there are things a city councillor can and can't do. My rent is too high. I want you to I want you to better control rents, and be ready to hear that the city councillor may say, that's not something I can do, right? Be prepared to ask them, well, who does do that then? And your city councillor will know who to talk to. But just getting informed on what the city does is your councillor's job, and you should never hesitate to ask them, hey, what do you do?
Shouldn't be scared to either. Through this experience myself, I'm learning. I'm still learning, and I've learned quite a bit. Things that I didn't know before, things that quite frankly I'm surprised I didn't know before. But that's how you get more involved. That's how you start to learn more about how your city actually works and how it operates. And I think it's very key that if you care enough, you show that you care by getting involved, whether it's sending an email to your city councillor, or just giving 311 a call, or just simply accessing the resources that are available to you online. And this is a good bridge to my follow-up question for you, which is, how do you think the city can make those resources that are available, because they are out there, how can they make them more visible to youth, more accessible?
Good question. So one of the things that I think councillors really appreciated in the past couple of budgets in this term of council is, you and I were talking about like the £6 budget, which is hundreds and hundreds of pages.
I'd say it's £10. So
You know what? It's heavy. Yeah.
It's really heavy.
You know what? You're probably right. It probably is about £10. Oh my God. We now publish a budget magazine. So the Treasurer's Office has put out we call it a budget magazine, and it explains in plain language a lot of what the budget means. Like, what does the budget do? What's within its scope? What do all these terms mean? Where do we get our money? How do we decide how to spend it? And more of those materials would be great. We do need to make sure, though, that we're meeting young people where they are. A lot of emphasis goes into social media like Facebook. Like, speaking as a politician, Facebook is just a godsend for me.
Yeah.
All the people in my ward, the voters, those millennials, and those Gen Xers and boomers, we're on Facebook. But you know what? My son is not on Facebook. My 23-year-old is not on Facebook. We probably need to start sending stuff in the mail directly to people's doors again. That is something that we kind of have abandoned, but that would be really, really helpful. And then I think some of those pop-ups, some of those tools like pop-ups, we need to go to where youth are to do those. It would be really weird for me to do a pop-up at Ottawa Youth because that's not my ward, right? Stephanie Plant is going to be like, why are you in my ward? What are you doing in my ward? But certainly I would encourage city councillors who do have academic institutions to do that. I should probably be on bus platforms more often. I should probably be at Tunney's pasture with a little table trying to stay out of the way to talk about, hey, I'm a city councillor. We run the bus. Talk to me. There are a lot of innovative ideas that are out there that we're failing to do. And I won't get into all the reasons why we're failing to do some of those ways of reaching out better to youth. They exist. We're not doing them, and we need to do better.
If a young person listens to this and feels curious or motivated, maybe a lot of what we said actually resonated with them.
Yeah.
What would you tell them?
So we've talked about a few different avenues of sort of next steps to learn more and to achieve change. And I'll emphasize again, talk to your city councillor. They are not intimidating people. You can call 311 and you can ask them, here's where I live. Who is my city councillor? What is their email address? As city councillors work on email. Don't instant message them or DM them on Insta, email them. But reach out to them and say, I would like to sit down with you for half an hour and find out more about what you do. And then if you have a notion of ways in which you think the city could be better, a city councillor, again, is a great person to ask to say, who's working on this? Right? Who are you hearing from on this issue? Who could I collaborate with? I would encourage people who watch this to reach out to their city councillor and have a chat. I would also encourage them to read the media, to follow social media from city channels, from people who cover the city. In Ottawa, you've got CBC, CTV, the Citizen Sun. In your local neighborhood, there is probably a community paper. Sometimes it's still printed that you can pick up. I'm thinking about the Centertown Buzz, the Kitchissippi Times, which is the one in my neighborhood. Follow the news. But there are other things like just following on Reddit. Take everything you read on Reddit with a grain of salt. Take everything you read on social media with a grain of salt, but read it and sort of get an idea for what are the debates that City Hall is having, and then reach out to the person who works for you, who is your city councillor.
I think there's a lot of knowledge out there on social media. Of course, it's very subjective, as everybody's got their own voice, right? But I think it's a great platform to use to just be informed.
Yeah.
Understand what's going on. And I think what's really important to know as well is that don't let the fear or the lack of knowledge control your behavior or your actions. I'm certainly still learning, and I'll continue to learn throughout this 12-week program. And I'm sure that by the end of it, I would have been very surprised with how far I've come and how much I've gained knowledge of. But that's what I encourage you to do, and that goes for anything, but especially when it comes to your own city. I think understanding municipal government a little bit more and getting in touch with your city councilor is a very important thing. Thank you, Jeff, for joining me here today. Do you have any final thoughts?
No, I think we've actually covered it in depth. So I just want to say thank you very much for hosting me here. Thank you very much to Youth Ottawa for what they're doing, and this has been awesome to be able to visit this new space. If I can be of any help to make sure that you're using it to its full extent, let me know.
For sure, we'll do. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you.